Good evening, everyone. Glad to see y'all back this evening. So how many of us have bad habits? I would safe to assume that every single one of us has a habit that we don't like and we don't encourage and that we wish that we could get rid of. It's a funny thing that habits control our lives in so many ways when sometimes we feel like we can't even change it or we can't even control it. Perfect example. That person cuts us off in traffic. Our initial response is to get back in front of him and cut him off because it brings us joy. I don't know why, but we'll get into that. So I stumbled across this book that was recommended to me by a colleague. It's called The Power of Habit. At first picking it up, I thought it was going to be this strange self-help book because he's all about that life. And I was like, I'll give it a shot. It's like 150 pages. I'll read it. So I started reading it. And it turned out to be a lot more than I thought it was going to be. So it begins talking about this psychologist has this female come in. She's very fit. She runs marathons. She's starting her master's degree in accounting. She's recently engaged. She has all these new things that's going on, as we would deem nowadays, very successful things going on in her life for her. The psychologist said that previously, 4 years ago, she was overweight, overeating, a smoker, drank, and recently divorced and was working at like a retail shop or something like that. Something drastically different than 4 years prior. So they started diving into the psychological effects of what drives us to change and what drives us to turn around and what drives our habits. A lot of the experience came from, a lot of the studies came from this guy. His name was Eugene. Perfectly good man, was approximately 57 years old at the time that his incident occurred. What happened was he came home sick from work one day. His wife said that his stomach was hurting and he was vomiting and he was having like a headache and stuff. So they took him to the ER, but it was unlike what he was used to. They pulled some cerebral spinal fluid out of his spinal cord area. And what they found was that his cerebral spinal fluid was cloudy and very viscous, when normally it's supposed to be clear and very runny. Later on, when he woke up they sedated him and put him into a coma. He woke up and he couldn't remember anything. He was 57 years old, but he could only remember up to age 30. And everything after that, he could only remember 20 seconds of. They started looking into him, and psychologists and neurologists started looking into what happened to his brain and stuff. And they went home and they were like, please draw me a map of your house. And he couldn't do it. They started looking into him and started kind of monitoring what he was doing. And every day he would get up, do the same exact thing. He would get up and go to the kitchen, make bacon and eggs, come back. A little time has passed. He would get up again, go make bacon and eggs. Time has passed, and make bacon and eggs, come back, sit down. A little bit of time has passed. He would get back up and go. It was a repeat cycle. They were like, why is he doing this? What is his purpose of doing this? The doctors told his wife that they want him to start walking and get exercise because he's taking in too much bacon and eggs. And so they get him to start going around the block and walking. Some time has passed. They start asking him, hey, Eugene, can you please draw us a map of the route that you're taking on walking? He goes, no, I can't do that. He was like, but you do it every day. Like, why can't you do this? Well, his wife comes home one day, or was getting ready one day, and he comes home and she's getting ready, and she goes out into the living room to tell Eugene, like, hey, I'll be back a little bit to stay here. And she can't find him. She's like, well, I don't know where he went. And so she starts racing down the road trying to figure out where he was at, and going on neighbors' houses, going to knock on neighbors' doors and asking where her husband was. She can't find him. So she comes back home to call the police, and he's sitting there in the recliner, and he has pine cones in his hands. And they cross the pine tree as they walk on their daily routine. So she got kind of skeptical because she knew that he went for a walk, but he can't even draw a map of where he went. So they're starting to she goes and tells the doctor this. The doctor's name is Dr. Squire. Starts going to tell the doctor this, and he was like very intrigued on it. So Dr. Squires came over to the house and let his wife kind of go and do her own thing, and kind of just sat in the background and watched Eugene as he was doing his daily task. And he would do the bacon and egg thing back and forth a couple times, and then at a certain point, he got up and walked outside and started walking around the block. So the Dr. Squires asked him, "Hey, Eugene, can I go, or can we walk?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure." And so he started walking, and they do the same exact path that he's always done. And as they were approaching the house, he goes, "Eugene, which one's your house?" He says, "I don't know." He's like, "How do you not know? You walk it every single day." Which brings to our point is so they start looking into his habits and stuff and start trying to see like what's going on in his brain. So they route his brain, they put little electrodes on his brain to see what's firing whenever he's seeing stuff. And the psychologist and the neurologist, Dr. Squire, start looking at what fires in Eugene's brain when these things are triggered. They deemed it down to that to form a habit that requires three different things. It requires a cue, a routine, and then a reward. In Eugene's head, you have this in the very center of your brain, you have this thing called a basal ganglia. And what that does, it controls your habits and controls what you do on a daily basis. The way that our brain is designed to archive as many habits as we can so we can think about higher level thinkings while we're doing other things. Perfect example is when you're trying to go to bed, how many of our minds race? A lot of us do. And then what that is our body knows it's supposed to be in bed, knows it's supposed to be going to sleep, but we can't shut that off because it's something that we just naturally do. And so our basal ganglia is what controls what our habits are. They started looking into a little bit more about about what exactly cues Eugene in order to make him do this. And what they found is there was commercials on TV. When a commercial break came on, he would watch this. They would put the same exact National Geographic show on. And every single commercial would come by, and he would get up and go get something from the kitchen when he couldn't remember where it was at. What they came to conclude is that our body, no matter what state it is in, damaged or not, it tries to archive as many habits as we possibly can so that it falls under the category, so it completes the law of efficiency. So how does that replicate into our lives? That was a strange medical thing that we talked about, but how does it replicate into our lives? It replicates into our lives because all of our habits, whether Christian or things that we do in our daily life, our morning routine, as we generically call it, our morning routine, we do the exact same thing because it makes us feel better. So as I stated earlier, our habits are shaped around a cue, a routine, and a reward. Another example of that besides Eugene is our American eating style. There's often think that Americans are the most overweight people in the world. And why is that? It's because we've developed a habit for it. We walk into the kitchen and we smell that, which is our cue. Our routine is to eat it, and then our reward is the satisfaction that it gets from it. Probably 50% of y'all here, I'm not sure if y'all suffer from this, but my generation and a little up suffer from the technology age, where we get a text message on our phone, our first habit is to pick it up and look at it. No matter if it's an email, no matter if it's a text message, whatever, a lot of our habit is to pick it up and instantly look at it because it triggers something inside of our mind that we have to pick it up at this moment. And whatever reward is from that, I have no clue because I don't have that habit as bad. But the point is our body naturally ingrains habits into our minds so that we can further think about other things higher up. We can always think about more intellectual things. We can see this in Paul's writing as well in Romans chapter 7. He talks about doing the exact things that he doesn't want to do when he knows they're bad, but he still finds himself doing them anyways. In the research that he talked about with Eugene is when we're doing habits, or when habits incur, they say that our brain peaks right in the first millisecond of a habit occurring when our cue is dropped. So that this is why if we were pulling out into the middle of the road, a lot of us can drive places and kind of be on autopilot because we're there in the moment and we're paying attention, but it's such a natural habit for us that we can drive without really thinking too much about it. And they say that our brain peaks whenever we do something new, that cues, that habit, so that we can see if any danger is coming in the way in the process of it. The same thing that, like with Eugene and stuff, he would continue doing the same things, and it would pique his mind at certain points, and then he would fall into that habit. They also did the same study on mice as well, but we'll get into that in a second. But going back to Romans chapter 7, it talks about we do the fleshly desires that we don't want to do. And when I was reading that, I was asking myself, why do we do that? Because I often fall in the exact same situation as well. We give into sin because, unfortunately, it's become a habit for us. We programmed ourselves to do the very thing that we don't want to do, because at that moment, that cue for that sin is completely present. I thought it was interesting. It said, scientifically proven, we cannot break our own habit. The cues are always going to be there. The only thing that can change of that is the routine. We can only rewire that routine, and we can look at a different reward for it. But the actual cue for it will always be there. They did a scientific study on mice as well, where they probed their brain and had them run down a hall, or they had a door in front of it, and they would release the door, and the mice would run down the hallway towards cheese, and they got into a habit of it to where as soon as they heard the click of the door, they would take off running. Well, at the very end of it, they started putting little obstacles in their way, and the mice would run into it. And then eventually they started seeing the mice would kind of run up to the same location, stop, run around, and then continue running. I'm like, how are they doing this? How are they able to realize that how are they able to recognize and reprogram themselves to do that? So how do we replace our habits? The main bulk of our text is going to be Philippians chapter 3 tonight. If you would turn there with me. As I was making this, I was kind of laughing because I get into the habit of whenever I start trying to make a sermon, I look at the very things that I'm doing around me, or like the things that I'm stressing with, or the things that I'm reading with around me, which is this book. And so I just kind of fell into the habit that I started talking about this. So I fall straight into this category. So if you read with me in Philippians chapter 3, verses 12 through 21, this is Paul writing to the church in Philippi. It says, not that I've already obtained this, or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus had made me his own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but the one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining towards what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let those of us who are mature think this way, and if any one of you thinks otherwise, God will reveal that also to you. Only let us hold true to what we have obtained. Brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. For many of us have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is their destruction, their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame, but with minds set on earthly things. But our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whom will transform our lowly body into this glorious body by the power that enables him even to the subject of all things. We look a lot into Paul's teaching. He expresses a lot in Romans, to put in Corinthians as well, and also a little bit in here. And we see that he talks about putting aside our old selves, and putting aside our old habits, and putting aside who we used to be in order to become something that we should be. So I was thinking about this and looking at this into this book, and how do we develop new things, and how do we develop new habits so that we can actually press on to the goal of Christ. We see in here that we have the goal, we have the reward that it talks about. And in verse 20, that reward is, but our citizenship is in heaven. We have the reward. Oftentimes, our routine is kind of there, but what about the cue? What cues us into getting into a routine of studying the Bible daily? I would go on a fair, safe assumption that if I would ask how many people actively read our Bible every single day, there would be a few hands that go up that don't. Unfortunately, mine included. And why is that? It's because our body isn't, we don't have We blame it on time. We don't blame it on something else. But a lot of it breaks down to we don't develop it into a habit to where we actually notionally think about it subconsciously till we go ahead and do this. They did another psychological study on runners and what makes people run long distance and how can they stick to it for such a long time, because I quite frankly think running is really boring. But why do they do this for such a long period of time and day in and day out? And what it is they find the cue that initiates their brain. There's a little part in their brain called the basal ganglia to fire off, we're about to do this as an activity. They went through and took a poll of a lot of different runners that run marathons, the Boston Marathon, all the famous marathons and stuff. And they came down to these guys and women would either go to bed wearing their running clothes, hopefully clean, or they would have it set up on their dresser so that the first thing that they do when they wake up, they'll instantly see it. And so these cues subconsciously create this habit to where the routine is they would go out and run, and then the reward is they feel endorphins afterwards, and they feel the high of running. So what happens with that with the Bible and stuff? Where does that fall into play? I believe we can make habits of anything. They say it takes 21 days to make a habit. It doesn't say good or bad. I think that we can, a lot of our habits and a lot of our things come down to us being dedicated into creating those habits and dedicated into creating these ideas that we have to long and yearn for them. Not just creating the idea of it, but the longing for it and setting ourselves up for success when we do this. I think another thing that we have to do is we have to be intentional about creating these habits for the Lord. I think a lot of times that talking about time is we're not intentional with our time that we have. How many of us go home after work and sit there and watch YouTube or TV and procrastinate for hours before we ever get up and do something else? We're not intentional with our time. We say that we have to wind down or something, but there's plenty of time to wind down. We can wind down in the Word. We can see the peace through the Word. We can see God's glory through the Word. We distract ourselves from the things that we should be doing, and we have created a habit that is detrimental to our faith because of the cues that we've created. After reading, or I have like a couple pages left in it, but the book solely focuses on the later half of the book. It kind of builds up and develops this idea about the habit routine, as they call it. And the latter half of it talks about rewiring ourselves, rewiring the way that we think about things, rewiring the way that we act towards certain situations. It talks about developing a good habit, as I stated just a while ago, requires initiative. It requires a constant thinking about, we have to do this when this happens. Thinking about that, I started looking at this week. I picked it up a couple weeks ago, and this week I was looking at cues of my life that created habits, and they were all over the place. I was like, the habits that I do in life, or the way that I respond to people saying stuff, is kind of all over the place because we have so many of them that we're ingrained with. And the difficult part about it is we have to be intentional about finding that cue. They talk about rewiring ourselves. Starts with finding the cue that leads into this routine because we're seeking this reward. So I have to ask you tonight, what is your habit? Is your habit a routine for the Lord? Or do we have bad habits that are causing us to stumble in our faith and causing us to put a separation between us and God? I think one of the routines that we have that we can definitely develop in is having one of the things that they kind of talked about as well is, if you want a routine, make it readily available. Readily available means having our Bible on our nightstand till we wake up and we can see it and it cues in our mind to start doing this. I think one of the things that we don't do enough of is take initiative in rewiring these routines, because the routine is the changeable part. It was once said by a wise guy that nature is like a vacuum. I can't remember his name. Nature is like a vacuum. Whatever we have, whatever is out there, we're going to suck up. Whatever it is, we'll absorb it and somehow, some way, it'll become a habit. That's our natural mindset, is we naturally try to create everything into a habit. So I have to ask you, what is your habit? If it's bad, we should probably start looking at changing it. If it's good, you should probably start doing it more. Or setting yourself up for more setting yourself up for more success. It's our job to think about it and to rewire it. The weird thing about it is when you look into the Bible, you see a lot of this as well. The Israelites would fall off into strange routines that we were like, what are they doing? Or you see Paul talking about him fighting with himself constantly. And if we're going to bring science into the equation, it's kind of interesting that a lot of it could and very well may boil down to how we have habits aligned in our life. So if you have the bad habits, take a look at them. If you have a bad habit, accountability with somebody else goes a long way to developing accountability to kind of combat what we have. Another thing about what we can do about habits is we can also pray about them. We can also develop a series of awareness that we can start changing these and start being more aware of when we start going down this sin path, that maybe this is what we're doing. Like I said, I used the example earlier about the guy cutting us off. A lot of us probably driving in Houston probably have mild road rage. Probably, because it's crazy out there. But when we go and cut somebody else off, is that right? Small thing seems pretty small, but we've ingrained that into our mind. If you have any habit that you want to pray about, if you have anything that's separating you from God, that where you routinely sin day in and day out because you can't figure out what's going on, or what's queuing it up, come pray about it. That's what we're all here for. If you have any needs, any prayers of the church, come now as we stand and sing.